Think about what it is like to live through this rather than read about it. A person in one of China's great cities endures day after day of record heat, the air heavy and dangerous, sleep impossible without cooling, the whole city leaning on a power grid that groans under the strain of everyone fighting the same heat at once. Then, weeks later, a typhoon bears down from the sea, and the same person watches it make landfall, pass, and then, impossibly, turn back and strike a second time. The rare double blow that no ordinary storm season prepares you for. And in the days after, the rain that storm carried falls in amounts no one there has ever seen. The heaviest single day in the entire history of the local records, until the streets become rivers and the familiar neighborhood is transformed into something out of a nightmare. This is not 3 different years or 3 different countries. It is one season, one nation, more than 1 billion people living through an unrelenting procession of extremes that keep arriving faster than anyone can absorb them, each one exceeding what came before. For the people inside it, this is not a chart of records. It is a summer of exhaustion and fear and loss, a season in which the weather itself has become a relentless adversary. And it is happening to more people at the same time than almost any weather anywhere on the planet. The word record is supposed to mean something. It is supposed to be the rarest word in the language of weather, reserved for the once-in-a-generation extreme, the day the old-timers talk about for the rest of their lives, the high watermark that stands on the wall for decades, because nothing ever comes close to it again. For most of human history, that is exactly what a record was. A monument to an exception. A boundary so extreme it defined the outer limit of what a place could do. But in China right now, that word has quietly stopped meaning what it is supposed to mean, because the records are not standing on the wall anymore. They are falling, one after another, across the whole span of what weather can be, so fast and on so many fronts that the word has been drained of its rarity. When the hottest ever gives way to the wettest ever, which gives way to the strongest storm ever, all in a single season, in a single country, the word record stops describing a rare exception and starts describing the ordinary condition of the sky. And that is the real story of the extreme weather tearing through China at this moment. It is not that a record was broken. It is that the very idea of a record, the notion that there is a stable outer edge to what the weather can do, is coming apart, edge after edge, in real time. Look at what the season has actually delivered, because the roll call is staggering when you lay it out. The country has been gripped by heat of historic intensity, one of the hottest such periods ever measured there, the kind that turns cities into ovens and pushes the power grid to its limit and quietly bakes the crops in the fields. It has been struck by a powerful typhoon that came ashore not once but twice, making landfall, weakening, circling back, and striking again, a rare and vicious double blow from the sea. In the storm's wake, rain fell in quantities that shattered the all-time daily records at multiple weather stations, the most rain ever recorded there in a single day. Previous marks that had stood for decades simply erased in a matter of hours. Rivers have swollen and overflowed. Cities have flooded. The monsoon has driven damage into the billions, and lives have been lost. Heat, storm, rain, flood, each one pushing past its historical ceiling, all of them arriving in overlapping waves across the same stretch of weeks. This is not a country having one bad event. It is a country having every kind of bad event at once, each of them setting a record. The entire menu of atmospheric violence served up in a single punishing season. The storm is worth pausing on because it shows how one system can shatter several records in a single stroke. A powerful typhoon is not one disaster, but a bundle of them. A surge of seawater, ferocious wind, and above all, a vast payload of rain wrung from warm, moisture-heavy tropical air. When such a storm makes landfall twice, striking, weakening over land, and then coming ashore again, it delivers that payload in a double blow, the second deluge falling on ground, already soaked by the first, unable to absorb another drop. That is how weather stations come to break their all-time daily rainfall records. The most rain ever measured there in a single day, marks that had stood for decades, wiped out in hours by a storm carrying more water than the older climate could have held. And rain that breaks records does not stay in the sky. It runs off the saturated land into the rivers and the streets, overwhelming drainage built for a gentler era, so that a rainfall record becomes a flooding disaster within hours. The heat, the storm, the record rain, and the flood are not four separate entries on a list. They are links in a single chain. The warm ocean feeding the storm carrying the rain becoming the flood, each link straining past its own historical limit as it drives the next. Pay attention to that plurality, because it is the part that matters most and the part that is easiest to miss. Any single record on its own is not alarming. Weather is variable, and in any given year, somewhere on Earth, some record will fall, simply because the natural churn of the atmosphere occasionally throws an extreme past the previous high. One record in one place, in one category, is just noise. But that is not what is happening here. What is happening is that many records are falling at once, in opposite categories. The scorching and the drowning, the parched heat and the record deluge, striking the same country in the same season. And that combination is not noise. It is a signal, because a stable climate does not break its heat record and its rainfall record and its storm record all in the same breath. A stable climate produces the occasional isolated extreme against a backdrop of normal. When the extremes stop being isolated, when they cluster and overlap and fall together across every category, the backdrop of normal is what has changed, and that is precisely what the plurality of these records is telling us. The dice are not throwing an occasional high number. The dice have been reweighted, and every roll now lands harder than the last. And it is not only that the extremes are larger, but that they arrive with a kind of disorder. The different faces of the weather crowding into the same window, instead of taking their turns across the calendar as they used to. In the old rhythm, the seasons handed off to one another in an orderly way. Each kind of weather in its proper time, the heat and the rains and the storms spaced out across the year so that a society could brace for each in turn. What a season like this delivers instead is a collision, the record heat and the record deluge and the record storm compressed together, overlapping, treading on one another's heels, as though the calendar itself had come unstuck and several seasons' worth of violence were being poured out at once. That disordering is part of what makes it so hard to endure and so hard to prepare for, because defenses and routines are built around the expectation that troubles come one at a time and in season, and a climate that stacks its extremes on top of each other, out of their old order, overwhelms the very structure of how a society copes. It is not just more extreme weather. It is extreme weather that no longer keeps to the schedule, arriving all at once, and that loss of order is its own kind of danger. There is a phrase people reach for at times like this, that there is no normal anymore, and it sounds like an exaggeration until you watch a season like this one unfold. For all of settled human history, the seasons had a shape you could count on, a rhythm within which the weather varied but stayed, mostly, within known bounds. You knew roughly how hot the summer would get, roughly how much rain would fall, roughly what the worst storm might look like, because the past was a reliable guide to the present, and that reliability was the quiet foundation on which everything was built. The crops planted, the cities drained, the defenses sized, the ordinary expectations of daily life. What a season like this one announces is the erosion of that reliability, the loosening of the bounds that used to contain the weather. When the heat exceeds anything in the record, and the rain exceeds anything in the record, and the storm exceeds anything in the record, the known bounds are simply gone, and with them goes the ability to say what a normal season even is. The weather is no longer varying within a stable range. The range itself is moving, and a country cannot plan for, or even fully imagine, a climate whose outer limits are sliding out from under it faster than the memory of the last extreme has time to fade. The physics behind it is not mysterious, and knowing it makes the pattern feel less like a run of bad luck and more like a system behaving exactly as a changed system should. A warmer atmosphere holds more water vapor, meaningfully more for every degree of warming, and that loaded sky comes down harder when it rains, which is why the rainfall records fall. Warmer oceans pump more energy into tropical storms, which is why the typhoons can grow so fierce and carry so much water. And the warming itself drives the heat to new highs directly, which is why the temperature records fall. Every one of the records shattering across China traces back to the same underlying change, a warmer, wetter, more energetic atmosphere, which means the different records are not separate strokes of misfortune, but different symptoms of a single condition. That is why they arrive together. They are not unrelated coincidences that happen to be piling up. They are the coordinated output of one warming, expressing itself simultaneously as record heat and record rain and record storms, each a different face of the same force pushing the whole system past its former limits at once. And China is a place where this lands with almost unimaginable weight because of the sheer scale of what sits in the path. This is a country of well over 1 billion people, with megacities holding tens of millions each. Vast plains where enormous populations live and farm, a long coastline exposed to every storm that spins in from the warm Pacific, and river systems that drain immense territories and turn deadly when the rains come too hard. When the record heat descends, it endangers more people and strains a larger grid than almost anywhere on the planet. When the record rain falls, it floods cities and drowns farmland that helps feed 1/5 of humanity. When the record typhoon strikes, it hits some of the most densely populated and economically vital land on Earth. So the record breaking is not an abstract entry in a meteorologist's logbook. It is a direct and heavy blow to one of the largest societies that has ever existed, its people sweltering, its streets flooding, its harvests threatened, its infrastructure hammered on every side at the same time. The enormous exposure turning each broken record into a threat to vast numbers of real lives. And the damage compounds rather than merely adding up, which is what makes a multi-front season so much more dangerous than the sum of its parts. When record heat has already pushed the power grid to its limit, a storm that knocks out power lands on a system with nothing left in reserve. When record rain has already saturated the ground and filled the rivers, the next downpour has nowhere to drain and produces far worse flooding than it would have on dry land. When one disaster has already exhausted the emergency crews and battered the infrastructure, the next arrives to find the defenses depleted and the last recovery unfinished. The extremes do not wait politely for one another. They strike a country already reeling from the previous strike, stacking their damage on top of each other with no time to recover in between, so that the total harm is magnified by the overlap. A society can absorb a single record-breaking disaster if it has time to recover before the next. What is far harder to survive is a season in which the records fall one after another with no gaps. The heat and the storm and the flood landing on the wounds the last one left. The damage accumulating faster than the recovery can keep up. There is a deeper implication buried in all of this, and it changes how we should think about every defense we have ever built. For all of modern history, the records were the ceiling, the worst case, the outer boundary we planned against. You built your flood walls for the worst flood on record, your grid for the hottest day on record, your emergency plans for the strongest storm on record, because the record was, reasonably, the edge of the possible, and preparing for it meant preparing for the worst. But when the records fall year after year, season after season, category after category, the record stops being a ceiling and becomes something closer to a floor, a level that this year's weather does not merely approach, but blows past. And that means our defenses, all of them, were calibrated against a world that no longer exists, sized for extremes that have already been exceeded, built to hold a line that the weather has already crossed. This is the quiet catastrophe underneath the dramatic footage, that the record-breaking is not just producing disasters, but invalidating the very basis on which we prepared for disasters, revealing our flood walls and our grids and our plans as monuments to an older, gentler climate, outrun by the one that is actually arriving. And the heat alone, set aside from everything else, would have been a historic story in an ordinary year. This has been among the hottest such periods the country has ever recorded, part of a longer run in which the warmest ever readings keep returning. The baseline of a Chinese summer creeping upward until records that once seemed extraordinary are matched and beaten as routine. That such heat is arriving in the very same season as record rain and record storms, rather than instead of them, is the whole strange point. A country pushed to its hottest and its wettest extremes in the same breath. It is worth being careful and honest here, because a single extreme season, however violent, does not by itself prove anything about the long arc of the climate, and it would be a mistake to rest the whole case on one summer. Weather is genuinely variable, and any one season can throw a run of extremes through natural fluctuation alone, but the honesty runs in both directions, because while one season proves little, the pattern across many seasons proves a great deal, and it is the pattern that should frighten us. This is not the first season of tumbling records in China or in the wider world. It is one in a lengthening chain, a run of years in which the hottest ever and the wettest ever and the strongest ever have arrived again and again, in which the phrase once in a century has come to feel almost hollow because the century's worth events keep showing up every few years. Set against that longer record, this season is not a freak to be shrugged off as bad luck. It is another data point on a curve that has been bending the wrong way for a long time. One of the more violent chapters in a story that keeps escalating. And it is that trajectory, not this single summer, that carries the true weight of the warning. And the costs are not abstract, running into the billions in a single stretch of weeks, and reaching, most worryingly, into the food supply. Roads and bridges and homes are destroyed, businesses shut, the machinery of the world's second largest economy disrupted by a sky it cannot control, the damage from one bad monsoon period alone climbing into enormous sums. But the deeper danger is the harvest, because the same extremes that flood the cities fall on the fields that must feed an immense population. The record heat withering crops. The record rain drowning and rotting them. The floods washing entire harvests away. A season of multi-front extremes is therefore also a direct assault on the food security of a fifth of humanity. A quiet crisis of ruined crops and rising prices beneath the dramatic images of flood and heat. The records are measured in degrees and millimeters, but their consequences are measured in destroyed harvests, in economic losses, in the daily security of enormous numbers of people made more precarious by a battered sky. So step back and see the season for what it actually is. A country the size of a continent, home to a fifth of the human race, being struck in a single stretch of weeks by record heat and record rain and record storms and record floods. The ceilings on every kind of extreme giving way at once. The people and cities and farms absorbing blow after blow from a sky that has lost its old restraint. From a distance, it is tempting to read each event as its own separate story. A heat wave here, a typhoon there, a flood somewhere else. Discrete misfortunes to be reported and forgotten. But they are not separate, and reading them separately is how the real story gets missed. They are the coordinated output of a single warming striking one exposed country on every front at the same time, and the simultaneity is the message. The records tearing through China right now are not a collection of unlucky coincidences. They are the sound of a climate breaking with its own past, the boundaries of the possible dissolving across the board, the worst cases of history quietly becoming the ordinary events of the present. And the hardest truth in it is that these records, as extreme as they seem today, are not the ceiling of what is coming, but increasingly the floor. Not the worst it will ever be, but a preview of the harsher normal a still warming world is steadily building, announcing itself now in China, one shattered record at a time.